3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability, uniquely,
without a heritage, every generation starts over.
Ask not
to remind the current regime
what your country...
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
to get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
When the War of 1812 ended, the U.S. economy had a problem. Stuff. Specifically, British stuff. British companies were selling their goods in the new American market. Our friends across the pond had better financial backing, large stockpiles of post-war goods, and were the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. This meant that they could finance and manufacture textiles and cutlery at scale, transport them to America, and sell them at prices that American manufacturers found difficult to match. This resulted in the enactment of the so-called Dallas Tariff in 1816, named after James Madison's Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander J. Dallas. It imposed a 20 to 25% duty on foreign imports. We now know this kind of policy, in which imported goods are taxed by the federal government, as a tariff. Tariffs are as hotly debated a topic today as they were in 1816. President-elect Donald Trump has demonstrated his support for tariffs, receiving criticism from both the left and some sections of the right. To understand the conservative approach to tariffs, I sat down with Richard Stern, the director of the Grover M. Herman Center for the Federal Budget, here at the Heritage Foundation. Richard Stern, welcome back to Heritage Explains.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
So today we are talking about tariffs. We hear this word thrown around a ton in our modern kind of political lexicon. Can you demystify this concept for us? What is a tariff? Why does this matter?
Well, you're right. It certainly has become the watchword of the day. And, if you ask 10 different people, you'll get 20 different opinions on what tariffs are. But I think the important thing for everyone listening at home to realize is that a tariff is a tax on imported goods or services. Mostly we talk about it on goods coming in. And so while that can sound scary, it wildly depends on what kind of tariff the president's using, what the purpose of the tariff is, exactly what that means for American consumers and businesses. And so there's no one uniform way that Americans feel tariffs. There's no one uniform effect of tariffs. But at a very simplistic level, it's just a tax on goods or services coming into the United States.
So obviously now President-elect Donald Trump is heading into his second term. In his first term, he also had some policies regarding tariffs. What happened vis-a-vis tariffs during Trump's first term?
So we all know the book, The Art of the Deal, Trump's kind of famous book about how you get people to the negotiating table and how you get positive deals out of it. So I think one of the really interesting things about the Trump presidency was he, for the first time in decades, used tariff threats and tariff policy really as a tool of negotiation to extract wins out of a lot of these foreign countries, many of whom we have close ties with, but still take advantage of us in the international scene. And a lot of these countries we're not so friendly with, but still trade with. And so I think perfect examples on this one is, we had the NAFTA trade deal. Trump rebranded it and reformed and negotiated lots of different changes to NAFTA, which became the USMCA, which obviously, I think by most counts and current conservatives would say this, is a better trade deal. It respects U.S. patent law more. It opens up foreign markets to U.S. exports. It makes sure that standards that we think are important here, health standards, for example, quality standards of all kinds of products, are backed more, are insured more, a myriad of things of this nature. And again, these are all things that Trump was able to get because he was able to credibly and successfully threaten the imposition of tariffs on Japan, South Korea, Canada, Mexico, being able to open up these markets, get them to respect our laws and to standardize trade practices. So I think that's a perfect example of where that was a win-win for American consumers and American businesses.
One of the bigger criticisms surrounding the use of tariffs is that when the government puts a tariff on imports on a product, that ultimately that price is to be paid by the consumer who is ostensibly an American consumer. So they have concerns that we are raising the prices of goods higher than they should be. What is your thought on that?
So that's very kind of textbook, straightforward economics on it. But that it buries the fact that there's more complexity, of course, to how these things work. So the most important thing I would say about this is the U.S. government exists. It takes in a quarter of all of the dollars earned and produced by American people and then spends it. Now, we, of course, at the Heritage Foundation have called for massive cuts to government spending. But in the meantime, how the government finances those dollars impacts all Americans. So what Trump has called for, of course, is not just imposing tariffs, which, yes, would have a burden directly on some Americans, but he has called for using tariff revenue to cut other taxes. That's the key part of this. So, yes, if you just impose a brand new tax with no other offset, it becomes a burden on Americans. But if you're using it as an offset to reduce other taxes, you can actually end up with a net benefit for Americans. So if we kind of walk down into the details on this one, perfect example on this is when you look at the tax cut bill that conservatives came together for, that Trump came together on, if you ask a liberal on it, they'll tell you that that tax bill raised taxes on this group and that group and whatever. What they're really trying to tell you is that the tax changes we made 8 years ago got rid of subsidies for certain left-wing green industries and used the pay-for from that to cut taxes for all Americans, to cut taxes on when businesses of all walks of life invest to expand their operations. So here, too, you can use tariffs to raise revenues that can be then used to reduce taxes right now that are highly punitive of business investments to expand their operations, or taxes paid by hardworking American middle-class families. So that's really what Trump has called for. In fact, he had called for replacing the entire income tax system with tariffs, which again would have the same kind of net positive effect. And so part of what I'm afraid here is I think a lot of people on the other side of this are focusing on half of the equation, but they're not focusing on what you do with those revenues, how you can use it to get rid of taxes that are much worse, much more punitive on the American public.
So over the weekend, President Trump made a couple of different statements regarding policies that he's proposing for his second term. There are kind of two main groups of those. The first one has to do with American trade policy with our immediate neighbors, with Canada and with Mexico. Can you talk a little bit about what he proposed there?
So he called over the weekend for a 25% tariff on all goods being imported from Mexico and Canada. Now, that might sound like a lot, but keep something in mind on this one. The size of U.S. imports from both countries combined is only about 2.5% or so of the entire U.S. economy. It's not that it isn't important, but it's a relatively small percentage. Take by comparison, exports from Canada to the U.S. are about a quarter of their entire economy. Mexican exports to the U.S. are almost a third, about 30% or so of the entire Mexican economy. So both of these countries rely tremendously on their ability to export goods to the U.S. But keep something in mind about this. Both countries don't respect our patent law. Neither country respects our border security. Mexico in particular the Mexican government in particular has worked hand in glove with a lot of these cartels, turning a complete blind eye to drugs and arms and, frankly, terrorists flooding across the southwest border. They have been complicit in the flood of illegal aliens across the border. So when Trump has threatened these 25% tariffs on both of them, what that came with was a statement from Trump saying that I will impose these if and only if these two countries continue to not work with us on our border security. As long as they continue to turn a blind eye to not respect the international norms that you would consider for a country you're friends with, that's when the tariff will take effect. And of course, instantaneously, you had him get on the phone with the Mexican president who promised to make good on some of this. Trudeau bent the knee and flew down to Mar-a-Lago to have a, quote, productive conversation with Trump. And so I would say we were already seeing the fruits from that threat over the weekend, where these two countries that for the last 4 years have been complicit in these violations of the American economy, of our laws, are all of a sudden, before Trump has even taken office, starting to act like friends, they're starting to make signals, at least, that they're going to follow our laws and respect what is good for the American public.
The second group of proposals has to do with the so-called BRICS countries. What is a BRICS country, and what is Trump proposing to do there?
So BRICS is a term that's been around for 20 or 30 years. It's a reference to a handful of developing countries. These were countries that were a generation ago considered to be dynamic, up-and-coming countries. Spoiler alert, they're still dynamic, up-and-coming countries, which is really just a way of saying that these are largely autocratic countries who don't believe in the rule of law, who don't follow the standard kind of Western and American practices of respecting the God-given individual rights of their people. And as such, these continue to be poor countries, largely run by dictators. The R and the C, for example, in BRICS are China and Russia. Now, some of these countries have made progress over the time. Some of those countries have opened their borders, have adopted more Western customs. India, for example, is another one of them. But these are largely non-market countries or mixed market countries that often do not respect the rights of citizens of the United States or other countries. Now, they came together and formed a BRICS organization that's taken in a bunch of other countries. And the key part of this, of course, is China, as you'd imagine, is the most powerful, most influential country in BRICS. China has threatened to create an alternative currency to the dollar, a currency backed by gold, but make no mistake, run by the Communist Party of China. There would be an attempt to dislodge the US dollar in terms of international commerce, in terms of how trade is conducted, and what is used as a reserve currency of the world. This is an imperialistic effort by the Chinese government. And so for the first time, and they've talked about doing this for years and years, Trump has said flat out, look, if the BRICS countries are going to do this, if they are going to try to topple the international currency regime, if they're going to try to topple the US dollar and replace it with a communist Chinese alternative currency, he will slap 100% tariff on goods coming in from those countries. This is a bold statement by an incoming US president to defend not just the US, not just the US dollar, but the international system that defends the rights, the God-given rights of individual people the world over against the abuses of the Chinese Communist Party.
So proposals are all well and good. Obviously, the Trump campaign is very ambitious on this issue. As you're kind of looking down the field, looking at what's going to happen over the next few months and possibly few years, what do you see potentially happening here?
So one of the interesting things about this, of course, is that the president is granted by Congress decades ago the authority to impose tariffs with executive action for things that deal with unfair trade practices, retaliatory tariffs, things of that nature, breaches of trade agreements, violations, etc. And so the president's talking about using that. Now, as you brought up, normally if I had to bet on Congress doing something, well, I wouldn't bet on a lot getting done. But this is one of those cases where, as I said, a lot of the countries we're talking about violate our patent law. They don't respect any of the laws that we have here. They try to smuggle goods on all the time. There are tariff authorities the president has that are roundly designed to deal with those sorts of malactions, those kind of nefarious bad actor, bad faith things being done by these foreign countries. And so the president has likely the authority to do all the things he's threatening with tariffs and not need Congress. Now, the flip side of that, of course, is that a lot of the tax bill is expiring this year. Again, you can blame Congress for that. And so Congress is going to come to the table next year and vote on some kind of tax package. This is an ideal moment for Congress to work with the president to do what we were just talking about, to use tariffs as a revenue raiser to then pay for cutting taxes across the board in a way that's very constructive for the American public. And one more aspect of that I think is really crucial to understand here, and frankly, I'm embarrassed by a lot of so-called economists in D.C. who don't tell the truth on what I'm about to say here, who frankly, I think are in the pocket of a lot of interest and don't care about speaking the truth on this. But the fundamental aspect of this is the U.S. tax code, as it is set up, favors foreign imports. You heard me right about that. Our tax code taxes Americans to subsidize the importation of foreign products. And even worse than that, our tax code double taxes American goods that are then exported. So, in fact, imposing tariffs in the broad way that Trump is talking about the first thing those tariffs would do is not burden American consumers. It would get rid of that current imbalance. It would get rid of the American subsidies for foreign production and the American double taxation of U.S. exports. And so, while we can debate other nuanced aspects of that, that is a critical feature of the story of the deindustrialization of the U.S. over the last generation, of the sense of America losing its capacity to produce and losing it to these foreign countries who we subsidize through our tax code. And so I think that's actually, I would have to say, the most important thing that I would like everyone to take away from our conversation today.
Richard Stern, thank you very much.
Thank you as always. Much appreciated.
Thank you to Richard Stern for his contribution to today's episode. You can follow Richard's work on X at Rich A. Stern, and you can read more about tariffs and economics at heritage.org. And thanks, as always, to you for listening to Heritage Explains. You can reach out to us with any thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Heritage Explains is written and produced by Mark Gagne, Lauren Evans, and John Popp.